pleasure to be here today, and it's always interesting when people say, well, it's a tough message. Harry Truman, our former president, used to be called Give 'em Hell Harry. Remember that name from Harry Truman? Well, what's interesting is Harry Truman said, I told them the truth and they thought it was hell. So here's the thing. We're going to talk about what we're seeing in the ag economy. And I'm not sure you want to hear it, but I think it's the truth. So if it's hell, it's simply the truth. So now, as an ag economist, I know the three things to be successful when you give a talk is have something important to say it clearly, and then shut the hell up. Who's ever heard an ag economist not do one of those three things when they give a presentation? Absolutely. So I'm going to call this talk Moneyball. So why Moneyball? Because there was a great movie that came out some years ago based on a good book. And it was about Billy Beane, manager for the Oakland A's. Back in the early 1990s, he was trying to beat George Steinbrenner's New York Yankees. And Billy Beane's problem was, there he is at Oakland, he has a little tiny budget, and he's trying to beat the New York Yankees with that big budget. And he says to himself, I have to do something different if I'm going to win. Now think about that in the context of farming here. Not everybody has 4,000 acres or 10,000 acres, all inherited ground, easy to roll, but we all got to play Moneyball. What Billy Beane did is he turned to something called cybermetrics. Well, what's cybermetrics? It's when people collect statistics, batting average, on-base statistics, all these things. And Billy Beane looked at it and says, there's got to be a way of looking at that data and understanding how can I spend my money better to get the players I need to be a winning team. Guess what? He was so successful that everybody copied him. And they play Moneyball not only in baseball today, but they play it in basketball, they play it in football, they even do it in all of sports. Moneyball is about using the right statistics to see what's the right thing to do with your investments. Let's think about that. Farming is a team sport. We're going to show you some statistics here. Over 80% of your yield will go to some crop input, whether it's purchased land that you own yourself, you pay yourself, or cash rent, or seed, or fertilizer, crop chemical, machinery, all sorts of things. 80% of the yield in corn and soybeans is going to go to those categories. So you have to be a really good purchaser and manager. That's Moneyball. So let's start out here. I'm going to start out with a different philosophy here. I've seen a lot of ag economists give presentations as well. And what I notice is they love to put up supply and demand tables. Here's where we think stock is, here's where we think supply is going to happen, here's where we think some demand is going to be, and here's going to be ending stocks, and we're going to have this price reaction. Okay. Who was disappointed by Monday's USDA report? Everybody in this room was disappointed by that report. I have some cousins out in western Minnesota. I saw them last weekend. We're celebrating 100th birthday for my uncle. And I'm just glad that western Minnesota is flatter than pancake, because they would have jumped off the curbs if they had any chance. But you know what? If you're in the game of trying to outthink the market or outguess the market, you're in the wrong game. We got to think about how things are connected. So let's start some questions here. I think if you're in farming, these are 5 questions you need to ask yourself on an ongoing basis. First off, what's corn worth? Seriously, that's a real question. What is corn worth? Because corn at $6 gives you different land prices, different machinery prices. Corn at $3.50 gives you different land prices and different machinery prices. Everything in agriculture, what you buy and what you sell for, are connected. And it's not random. They are connected through the economics of the market. Now, if I can get you to give me a number, I'm going to ask this question. Why is corn worth that? For example, I'll meet people who say corn should be worth $8 a bushel. Why? Well, because it helps me make a lot of money. Well, that's fine. But why would somebody buy it from you at $8 a bushel if they can't turn around and make it into something even more valuable? So the thing we always got to remember is that when you go dump a truckload of corn or soybeans or whatever, the person that's writing you a check is only doing it for one reason. Not out of the goodness of their heart, but because they think that their business can take that product and turn it into something even more valuable. Whether that's milk, chickens, hogs, cattle, or put it in a barge and take it out and ship it out of New Orleans, they're buying it to make more money. So if you think corn's worth this, the question is, what can they turn into that's even more valuable? Because it's no good for us to grow things unless somebody else can make money on buying it from us. Okay, I talked about this just a second ago. Who gets what share? You're thinking, well, what do you mean, who gets what share? It's my corn. Yeah, but this is a team sport. You didn't provide the technology. That seed technology, that crop chemical technology, that fancy equipment, all those people are helping you get that yield, and they want their share. So the question is, what's a fair share? You need to know when somebody is getting a fair share from you, because you can't do without them, but you don't want to overpay them either. We'll talk about how we know that. And then what differentiates you? You can't go in and think you're going to do it like everybody else. You got to go in there with your own program. How are you going to be different? Everybody's got different advantages and different disadvantages. Some people are younger, some people are older, some people inherit a lot of ground, others didn't inherit anything. So what are you going to do? What's going to make you different? Because if you're not different, you're not going to be successful. So once you figure out those first questions, you got to put together a program that you can execute. That's a real important thing. If you don't have a plan that you're executing, you're just making it up as you go, and that's not going to be very successful. So let's answer that question. What is corn worth, and why is it worth that? The longest running database in the US government is cash corn prices. They have monthly cash corn prices since 1867, the start of the Civil War. You know why? Because corn is what powered horses and everything else during the Civil War. It was an important input into the war effort. So they started collecting corn prices. Well, I didn't go all the way back to 1867. I went back to 1918 in honor of my Uncle Phil, just turned 100. But I want to point out something here. We don't start out down here in this bottom left-hand corner and just see corn get progressively more valuable over time. Because here's what I've heard you say, and you've heard it said by other people. More people, better diets in the future will make corn more valuable. Who's heard that statement from somebody over the last 10 years? Absolutely. But why? We got way more people than we used to have. We got way better diets than we used to have. And corn just doesn't get more and more expensive over time. What are the two things that we're missing when they say more people and better diet makes corn more valuable in the future? They forget about rising yields, okay, and feed efficiency. We feed animals way better today than we used to feed them. When you look at hog producers today versus 10 years ago, they have 40% more pigs per sow than just 10 years ago. That's an incredible improvement in feed efficiency. So the reason why we go in these stair steps is because we have countervailing forces. Supply, demand are always working against each other. Look at the far right-hand corner of that slide. What's your new guess on corn? I don't know what you want it to be, but you got to look at that and be realistic. What's it going to be? $4 corn, $5 corn, $3 corn? But why? And who else would step into the game if we had that? So let's talk about technology. Touched on it just a second ago. Here's a statement. Technology respects nobody's opinion and nobody's politics. For example, in this room, how many people like ethanol? Show of hands. Who thinks ethanol is a good deal? Oh, come on. What are you, vegans? Too damn weak to raise your arms? Of course you like ethanol because it's a good demand source for corn. And without it, we'd be still stuck at $2 corn, right? But there's other people who don't like ethanol. And you hear them all the time on Facebook, blah, 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 this and that. Guess what? You got technology that doesn't care about any of that. What about new battery-powered vehicles? How much ethanol does a Tesla use? None. How good can battery-powered vehicles get? Who knows? But guess what? There's an example of technology not caring about your opinion or your politics. It's going to happen whether you like it or not. So there's an old expression, and I like to keep it in mind. It says, change the rules, change the game. And people don't like that. They say, darn it, to use a better word than I usually use, darn it, why are you going to change the rules on me? Because that's how the world works. Let's think about an example here. Here we are in Indiana. I know you guys love basketball. Show of hands, who likes basketball? Come on, Hoosiers. We love basketball, right? Anybody in this room old enough to remember when there was no three-point line? Show of hands. Who's old enough to remember when there was no three-point line? Younger people are like, what? There was never a three-point line? That's crazy talk, right? No, the crazy talk is one day they got together and drew a line artificially on the floor and said, inside this, it's 2 points. Outside this, it's 3 points. They just made it up. Let me remind you, they just made that up. Pure make-up rules. So when you only had a 2-point shot, you got Shaquille O'Neal as close to the basket as possible and just pounded it through the hoop. Why? Because all shots are worth 2 points. Somebody comes along, artificially draws a line on the board and says, hey, inside, outside, 2 points inside, 3 points outside. What do you do as a Moneyball manager? Start thinking, well, how often do I make a 3-point shot versus a 2-point shot? Which one gives me more benefit? And if I'm going to shoot 3-point shots, do I want big, fat Shaquille O'Neal? Don't tell him I said that. But Do I want big, fat Shaquille O'Neal sitting by the hoop, or do I want somebody who can move and shoot from beyond the three-point line? Well, you do the math. And guess what? Tomorrow, they could draw a 5-point line on that side. And then you have to ask the math again. Well, what's it worth to shoot a 5-point? You know, who could shoot a good 5-point? Bunch of skinny white guys? Yeah, I'd like to see that. But when you think about that, you're asking the question, who makes up these rules? Well, who knows? They just change. Just like technology, just like politics, just like trade disputes, it's outside of our control. We got to play the game as it is. Technology is going to happen. It's interesting that you can see technology change. Put that out there in the clouds. It just happens. It's genetics. It is crop chemical. It is IT. For example, how many people in this room have a smartphone in their pocket? Every single one of you, right? They did not invent that with farmers in mind, but there's not a farmer who can farm today without a smartphone. And you think about all the technology, it's going to do one thing. It's going to come into farm technology, and it's going to impact farmers, and it's a contractionary loop. We're going to have less farmers because you can do more with less people. Same as every industry. Good example of that. Go back in the early 1980s, we had about 715,000 farmers planting corn and soybeans, and they planted about 142 million acres. Took them longer to do it. 2012, 2016, we had half the farmers, 349,000. They planted 170 million acres of corn and soybeans, and they planted them faster and sooner. Why? Because they had better equipment. I guarantee you, you talk to my cousin Mike, he will tell you he's not a better farmer than my Uncle Phil. My Uncle Phil would tell you he was not a better farmer than my grandfather John, and my grandfather John would tell you my great-grandfather Peter was a pretty good farmer. But they get better yields, not because they're better farmers, but because the technology is there. They can harvest it faster. Same graph, just on the harvest side. We harvest it faster because we can. What do you think is going to happen in the future? Do you think farming is going to get slower? No. The equipment's going to get bigger, it's going to get more expensive, and it's going to be a challenge if you don't know how to play the game. So let's think about this. What do you hope? Here's something I see too often. People think they can market their way out of this problem. If I just got a little bit of information better, if the USDA would just give me a little bit of help, I'd be able to outmarket the market. I'd be able to sell my corn and soybeans for more than everybody else. Guess what? That's not going to happen. I worked for Cargill down in South America for 4 years as a grain trader. I guarantee you that Cargill is no smarter than you are. What Cargill has is much deeper pockets than you have. So they can make it back from a mistake that they make, right? But Cargill doesn't make money in trading corn and soybeans by being smarter. They handle logistics. They do basis. They're not trying to guess the future because they don't know the future. I know that for a certain database. It's called the FinBin database out of University of Minnesota Farm Management Database. So FinBin is an online place you can go to look at farming. A lot of people in there. There's about 1,500 farmers. I'm going to look at cash rent corn, okay? Why cash rent corn? Because it's pretty clean. When you think about it, you meet a lot of people who have rented ground and owned ground. And you ask them, what does it cost to farm your owned ground? Well, that depends on what they charge themselves as a cash rent. Could be high, could be low. But on a cash rent ground, you pay the neighbor, you know what it is. So I split the group, about 1,500 farmers in this database. I split them into two pieces, low-cost producers and high-cost producers. High-cost producers are the red, low-cost producers are the blue. What do you notice? Everybody went up together, peaked in 2012, and everybody came down together. Here's a statement I told earlier today. No one's under oath at the coffee shop, okay? So if you want to go someplace for good misinformation, go to the coffee shop. Because they will tell you about the one truckload they sold at the top of the market. And they won't tell you about the other 15 or 20 they sold randomly throughout the year. So what do we see when we look at the average sales price of corn per bushel from low-cost producers and high-cost producers? It's the same thing. Look at the last 4 years there. It's literally the same thing. In 2018, the difference on the average sales price between low-cost and high-cost producers, 1 penny. That was all. 1 penny difference. 1 penny is not making a difference. But let's think about that. How about cost of production? You can outproduce your competitor. That's why Superior Ag is having this event today. They want you to look at those technologies so you can make the smart decisions on both the numerator, yield production, and denominator, which is cost per bushel. They want you to make those smart decisions. This is not about getting cheaper. We're going to talk about that in a second. But you can outproduce your competition. So let's take those same two groups, low cost, high cost, and let's compare the cost per bushel between these cash rent producers. Wow. There's typically a $1 difference per bushel in cost of production. You're thinking, wow, where's that come from? We'll see it in just a second. It is better purchasing, it is better operations, better agronomics, all those things put together. It's not about economies of scale per se. It is about being a better buyer and a better user of those technologies. But that's a huge difference over time. This is the difference being in the low cost versus the high cost. Now, this is 50-50. So I'm not talking extremes here, just the bottom versus the top half. So let's think about that. What's the impact? Well, over time, between the marketing and the cost of production, here's what you saw on profit per bushel. 2012 was a great year in Minnesota. We had great weather, we had great prices. I want to point this out. Even the worst producers, the bottom half of the producers, they made $1 per bushel on profit. That was their watermark year. That's the year they wrote home about. But what didn't they know? What didn't they see? They forgot that the same year, low-cost producers in Minnesota made $3 per bushel. That's a $2 differential per bushel. Wow. So even though you had a great year, what you didn't know was you fell behind, way behind, because these guys have got that much further ahead of you. Okay, 2014 was a bad year in Minnesota. Poor yields, poorer prices. Yeah, these guys lost almost $2 a bushel. Yeah, these guys lost something. They lost about 25, 35 cents a bushel. Okay, they're hurting. But once again, they got further ahead of everybody because they didn't lose as much as they lost. And then, look at the last 4 years. Not much profit for being low cost, but certainly way more impactful than being a high cost producer. It's interesting. My wife's a tough customer. She told me I had to lose 40 pounds. I had to be thinner than a farmer's profit. I showed her that graph. She said I lose another 30 pounds. That's not nice. So it's tough out there. So where do those numbers come from? And we'll make these slides available for you. So what they do in that database is they break it out into 20%, lower 20%, and then up to the high 20%. So this is cost of production. So we got low cost, high cost. So low profit, high cost is over here. Low cost, high profits on that side. So I said, okay, let's just compare the bottom to the half. Because sometimes you know what stops people is they say, man, how am I ever going to make a difference? Guess what? It's a game of inches. So you say, how do you get that $1 per bushel? Well, let's look at that. We got about, let's see, 1,500 operators in this database. For example, let's start with yield. These guys, about 172 bushels per acre. These guys, about 185. So they got 13 more bushels per acre. That's one way to get low cost. You have more yield. You're dividing those expenses by more output. That helps drive down that cost. So here's the problem you got to avoid. If your yield goes down faster than your expenses, saving money is not going to save you on your cost of production. It's going to save you dollars per acre, but it's not going to make your corn any cheaper when you sell it. So they had 13 more bushels per acre. Let's look at seed here. Seed, wow, these guys paid about $113 per acre. These guys got in the field, let's say, for about $105, $104 per acre. They're $11 cheaper getting into the field. You think, well, wait a minute, how did that work out? I'll tell you this. There's two ways to think about that. One is, when did they buy their seed? And what kind of seed did they buy? And how much did they use? I'm pretty sure that these guys had at least as high or higher seeding population than these guys, even though they paid less. Maybe they used more programs. Maybe they were working with their seed salesmen to get those discounts. You have to look around, think about those things. What about fertilizer? Once again, these guys, let's just say about $120 an acre for fertilizer. These guys are in the field for $105 an acre, $18 per acre differential. Now you think about that on a per bushel basis. This is where it becomes a game of inches. These guys saved 11 cents per bushel on seed cost. 14 cents a bushel fertilizer cost. Repairs, 9 cents a bushel. Here's the big one, land rent. 32 cents a bushel. And then here's interest. Why do they save on interest? Because these guys are so far behind, they're borrowing more money. But you add that up, that's about 73, 74 cents out of that 95 differential there. So you think to yourself, let's talk about land for a second. How could they rent ground for less and get higher yields? Well, this is something I'm going to repeat a little bit later on. They know the power of no. No one in this room can fix the land market. Show of hands, who thinks the land market's broken? Not very efficient. Oh, come on. I'll show you. It is very broken. It's very inefficient. And you can't fix it. The only thing you can do as a farmer in the land market is know when you have to say no. Am I saying it's pleasant? You have a long-standing rent relationship with somebody, and you know you're losing money, and you put the numbers on the table, and they will not change. Why? They tell you, I got 5 guys lined up behind you who will pay me that or more. You know what your response has to be? They can have it. That's a tough response. But I guarantee you that you look at these guys and their land rent, they probably said no more often than these guys. $125 an acre, more yield, 95-cent differential. Remember that number, because we're going to see Purdue's number, almost the exact same thing, 2018. Now, let's talk about that. It's a team sport. You only get paid for what you bring to the game. But what do you bring to the game? You've got to ask yourself that question. What are you bringing to the game? One thing you bring to the game is assets. You guys own assets, whether it's land or it's equipment or you have inventory. The question is, well, what are you shooting for? There's something we talk about in economics called return on assets. So if you own assets, what do you hope they're going to pay you back? In farming over the last 8 years, the average return on assets has been 5.2%. Well, what does that mean? It means if you have $1 million of assets, tractors, land, whatever, you should generate, on average, $52,000 of income. Okay? Is that a good number or a bad number? Well, guess what? It's a number, and you got to know where it is. Because how many people didn't sell the rally this summer? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. I know you don't want to raise your hands. Oh, didn't sell the rally. Thank you for that honest answer. Probably for a couple of reasons. One is you were afraid you weren't going to crop, right? There's there. And let's have to admit a little bit, you thought it might get even a little bit better in the future, right? So a little bit of a mixture between those two. But here's the thing I keep talking about with marketing. Marketing has to be something that's not emotional. It has to be about what is the long-term returns and profitability that I need to have to want me to do this. So 5.2, there's a number. Everybody always thinks that somebody got a better deal than them. I always say that farmers always think the grass is greener over someone else's septic tank, right? So you think about that. They always think everybody else is making a ton of money. Well, some do, crop chemical equipment. You can see they have a little bit higher ROAs. But look at grain handlers. Interesting. Everybody's thinking grain handlers make a ton of money. They're buying it from me cheap. 4.6%. They actually have a lower return on assets than farmers do over this last 8-year period. So what are you? You're a general manager. You're Billy Bean. You remember that name, Moneyball. And what's your job? You're evaluating those technologies that are out there being your players. Because when you think about it, farming used to be a different sport. It used to be a different business. It used to be about working hard. I call it the difference between rowing and sailing. Anybody in this room ever rowed a rowboat? Okay. If you get in a rowboat, right, about 10 minutes later, you know all there is to know about rowing a rowboat. There's not much to know about rowing a rowboat, okay? If you want to go faster, what do you got to do? You got to work harder and sweat more. Now think about sailing. Get in a sailboat, it takes a long time to figure out how to sail a sailboat. It's complicated. But guess who's doing the work? The wind's doing the work, right? You don't do the work in the sailboat. You set your sails, you adjust to the wind. The wind does the work. So we got to be the same way in farming. Let's go back and look a long ways. Go back to 1910. So what do we have up here? This is the percentage of U.S. crop revenue that got spent on 5 categories that they've been tracking over this entire time. Seed purchases, electricity, fertilizer, pesticides, fuel, and oils. Think about that. Back in 1910, my great-grandfather Peter, my grandfather Uncle John, boy, between 10 and 5% of crop revenue went into these categories. Look where we are today. 45% of crop revenue is going into these same categories. Why? Because back in 1910, 1920, there was nothing to spend your money on in western Minnesota. You saved your seed, there was no fertilizer, there's nothing you could buy, you know? Today, 45% of the yield in the country is going into these categories versus the crop. Wow. Because without them, you will not produce high-yield crops. And without high-yield crops, you're not going to be in the game. What's another way of looking at it? Same information, different take on it. Here, the USDA went back and said, okay, let's break it into 3 big pieces. Capital, that'd be things like equipment. Labor, which we know, because that's what we pay ourselves or hired help. And then intermediate factors. Now, they adjusted these for inflation to make them comparable. But intermediate factors are things that you purchase from Superior Ag and others. They are third-party suppliers to you. Look at this chart and think about it for a second. Right after World War II, when they started collecting this data, it was a labor-intensive industry. You could outwork your neighbor to be successful. Look where we are today. Labor and capital are important still, but it's the purchased inputs that drive the world. The single best skill set that you can have is buy things smart and use them smarter, okay? And you're here today, and that's a good indication that you want to do that. Superior Ag is here today to talk to you about doing all that. This is what technology is about. So let's think about that. You make trades, and you want to know, am I getting the right trade? Is this the right thing that I'm doing? Because here's something I often figure out. People get blinded by the dollar. They say stuff to me all the time, and I'm wondering, like, well, why would you say that? For example, let me ask a question here. Is 0 degrees cold? Show of hands, who thinks that 0 degrees is cold? Oh, you know it's a trick question, right? Well, I'm from Minnesota. Let me tell you something. If it was 32 below 0 last night, 0 sounds really, really warm to you, okay? If it was 40 degrees and you're going down to 0, it sounds really cold. Think about it another way. I was down in Iowa a couple weeks ago, very big landowner, very, very successful, and he told me, Mike, I'm back to buying farm ground. I said, well, why? Why, Brian? He says, well, it's down $2,000, $3,000 from the peak. It has to be cheap. I'm like, well, Brian, how do you know it's cheap just because it got cheaper? It might not be cheap enough. So we need to understand that it's not the dollars that make us. We got to look at the real trade. Because you pay for everything in corn and soybeans, you got to ask, what am I trading? So I'm going to go back to that database. Once again, cash rent corn, going all the way back to 1994. And I asked myself the question, if I just look at spending by category, dollars per acre, obviously the dollars today are much bigger than they were in 1994. But is that really true? So I went back, I took the dollars per acre, I divided it by the price of corn per bushel. So I said, okay, think about it this way. If I spent $100 and I have $2 corn, I spent $100, or I can say I spent 50 bushels, okay? And then how does that 50 bushels compare to the yield? What percentage of my yield did I give to the landlord, to the seed producer, to the fertilizer people, to the crop chemical guys, to the equipment people? And this is what we see. Moves a lot of things going on. But here's a good example of technology changing. Look here, in the mid-90s, almost to the beginning of the 2000s, seed and fertilizer each got about 10% of corn yield. You had to give away 10% of your corn to get your fertilizer needs met and 10% to get your seed needs met. Let's walk all the way out to 2018. Now, thanks to embedding technology in the seed, 15% of your yield goes to seed and only 5% goes to crop chemical. The crop chemical lost market share to the seed technology. The question you have to ask yourself is, what do you trade? Are you aware of what the right trade is? And Todd will talk about a little bit more, is take fungicide. Somebody says to you, well, fungicide is $35 an acre for the application, right? Well, if corn is currently $3.50 at your local elevator, you could say it's $35 an acre, or you could say it's 10 bushels per acre, right? And then the question you have to ask yourself is, if I apply 10 bushels, I give them 10 bushels of corn, and they save me 25, was it a bad trade? Can you really say, can your banker tell you, well, you can't put any more money on the acre? What? That's crazy talk. I'm going to give him 10, he's going to give me back 25. How am I not better off with 15 bushels positive in my pocket? It's about trading corn for corn. The same thing is true for soybeans. Soybeans has a different cost structure. Corn is fertilizer intensive. Soybeans are more land intensive in terms of their trade, more seed intensive. But once again, let's look at that seed technology versus crop chemical. Go down here, back in the 1990s, seed was only 5%. You guys basically brown bagged your seed. Here, crop chemical was 12%. They flipped. Now you have a different relationship between seed technology and crop technology. Technology changed the rules, changed the game. And guess what's going to happen in the future? I don't know. My favorite two answers are, I don't know and I was wrong, right? And Wells Fargo keeps me employed because they don't expect anything from economists. And there is a problem with economist jokes. We don't think they're funny and you don't think they're jokes. but you need to know the cost structure. For example, going back all the way to 1994, things have changed, but I said, let's look at the big six, just to make it that. Soybeans and corn, seed, fertilizer, big difference. Fertilizer for corn is way more intensive. Doesn't make it more expensive, just means you apply it to something different. Crop chemical, land rent, yeah. Soybeans, they consume 34% of your yield for land rent. Corn, 27. At the end of the day, it's about 80% are going into those categories. The question is, are you buying them smart and using them smarter? So, let's talk about the big one, land. The single biggest category, go back here and you look at it, 30+% of your expense in the yield over the last 20-some years has been land. And the land market is not stable. Look in the early 2000s, cash rents as a percentage of yield were way too high. It was tough to farm back then because the landlords were getting way, way more of the share of the yield than they should have. You had cash rents that were a fraction of today's cash rents, but in comparison to the yield and to the value of the crop, were way higher. Well, then guess what happens? We introduce biofuels, we like that, and we drive up the price of corn and soybeans faster than the market can catch up to them. Bang, get here to 2012, great year in Minnesota. Wow, way behind. But guess what happened? See the price of corn and soybeans come back down? Guess what the landlords did? They dug in their heels. They're like, hey, you guys had some great years, we're going to have some great years. But guess what? At 35% in 2018, when you look at that combined trade, 35% was going into land. It's too high by 5%. This is a game of inches. This is a game of inches. This is not something where you can give away 5% of your yield and not expect it to kill your bottom line. So what are you going to do about it? That's the tough question, because if it was easy, everybody would do it. Think about that. Another way to look at it. Here we have corn price. That's on the right-hand side, price per bushel in Minnesota. Here's that land rent from that cash rent group we just looked at. Yep, corn peaked in 2012, $6.49 a bushel. Last year, $3.44. That's about a 50% reduction in corn prices during that period of time. Guess when land rents peaked? Yep, they peaked in 2014, 2 years after. And then they're all the way down to $197. I say that a little bit facetiously. That's only 10% off the peak. Wow. Corn and soybeans are 50% off their peak. Land has come down 10% on its rents. But guess what? You hear people say, yeah, well, cash rents have come back down. They're more or less doable. No, they're not. On a historical basis on a trade, that's not working. That's the biggest single drag on farm incomes. Now, here's the problem that we have in this room. You both own land and rent land. And guess what happens if cash rents go down? Your land becomes worth less, because land values are very much tied to that cash rent in the market. So what are you going to do about it? You're not going to fix the market. I guarantee you. I can't fix it. You can't fix it. Sonny Perdue can't fix it. It is millions of landowners and millions of renters. But you can work with the motto, which is farm the best, forget the rest. What do I mean by that? I'm going to show you the Perdue data. Now, Perdue don't lie, right? We all know that. Show of hands, who knows that Perdue don't lie? Even in Minnesota, we know that Perdue don't lie. But we'll see the data here. So think about what you're doing. The colors didn't work quite out on the screen, but you got a farming operation and you got a land management operation. Think about that. You do both things at the same time. When I really want to get my cousins upset, I tell them, this is what you should do. You should let your wife have the option to rent the farm ground to you or someone else. Oh, think about that. Take a typical farmer out of Iowa. Owns 1,000 acres, rents 2,000. I always say to them, look, your wife should be able to rent you the ground or not. If somebody comes along and outbids you on your own ground, she should be able to rent that ground to them. They do not like that at all. And I say she should be able to collect all the cash rent from you or from a third party on the ground you own. Oh, she likes to hear that. She shakes her head. Oh, yeah, that sounds really good. And I say, but wait a minute. You got to pay all the property taxes. You got to pay all the family living expenses. You got to pay for future investments out of that income stream you have as well. Because what he's going to generate off his farming operations is because of the talent and the labor he's putting in, not because of the land contribution. So everywhere you look, there's a problem with the data. There's a problem in the market. Like I said, I'm going to use Perdue. And you're going to hear in a little bit that there's a new rent survey out. It shows the exact same thing. Didn't change one bit. 2018, 2019, different numbers, same problem. So let's use the statewide cash rent survey. So you go across the 6 different districts of Indiana, low yielding ground, estimated yield of 136, average yielding ground 170, high yielding ground 204. Here's their budget. The only thing that changes in Purdue's budget is that for high yielding ground, you have to apply more seed per acre, more fertilizer per acre to get that seed to perform. But you look at the ownership, the labor, basically the fixed cost. Now look down here. Here was the estimated cash rent in 2018. Farmers are paid by the bushel, landlords are paid by the acre. You got to remember that every single day. Because if you look at this and you say, well, that looks reasonable, 661, 745, and 816, you're missing the point. Because when you look at the differential on a per bushel basis, it becomes very clear. So let's do that. I'm going to take all of these expenses and divide it by the expected yield in that survey. Now we have the expense or the cost per bushel. Wow, look at this. Cash rent on low yielding ground, they only paid $1.11 per bushel. And those guys had to pay $1.21. They had to pay a 10-cent penalty per bushel. Was it a penalty? Oh, no, it wasn't, because they had almost a 96-cent advantage on everything else, because they had 68 more bushels per acre to spread all that other cost over. That drove down their cost of production. They have an 86-cent differential between the cash rent and the other things, 86 cents. What was it in Minnesota? 95 cents. So it's the same thing. So what you're seeing is that when you have bad ground, you just can't make it pay. Because if the yield is a yield and you can't fix it because of other things you're doing, you can't pull out enough expense. I was up at Fort Wayne a couple years ago. I was showing a similar chart, and one of the old retired farm landowners was upset. He said, you're telling me that I have to rent my ground so cheap that I won't even be able to pay my property taxes? And the answer was, I'm not saying that, sir. I'm just telling the farmers that we finance not to rent your ground. That's all I'm saying. You can find somebody else to rent your ground. So I'm going to finish up here. Hopefully I have some time and some questions. You get paid by the bushel. You got to remember that. When you pull up to the scale, they never ask you, how many acres are you farming? No, they don't. They ask you, how many bushels are in this truck? And what's the grading? Because that's what they're going to pay you on. You know, and I was teasing with a couple guys earlier from Winfield saying, hey, you know, I've seen the mating dance of the U.S. farmer many, many times. You might have seen the same mating dance. Get two farmers together, they don't know each other, have a little bit of small talk, and then they ask the question, well, how many acres do you farm? First guy says, I farm 2,000 acres. Second guy says, oh, isn't that nice? Well, you know what that means, right? It means he farms more than 2,000 acres, so now he's the big dog in the room, right? But you don't get paid by the acre. You get paid by the bushel. And so if it's not about getting the right bushel cost, you're not getting there. And your success is your average. You know, you're going to hear from Todd and a lot of other people. You got to treat every field differently. You got to treat every acre differently. Absolutely. And sometimes there's something called addition through subtraction. Anybody ever heard that phrase before? Addition through subtraction? It's when you get rid of something that's such a drag on your performance that you actually get better. I'm willing to bet that if you go back and look at your crop insurance records, you probably hopefully keep all your APHs by individual operating unit, and you look at that, you're going to have great, average, and poor. And the question is, when you look at that poor ground, you say to yourself, do I own it? Do I rent it? And you have to think about that. If I own it, why don't I rent it to somebody I really don't like? That way they can lose money on it, right? Well, that's a real strategy, let me clue you. It makes you feel really good when you cash that check. If you're renting it, you got to say to yourself, well, maybe I could stop renting it. Well, then what do I hear from the farmer? Well, I got a lot of equipment. Oh, really? Then why don't you right-size your equipment? Because if you can't change the land, you can change your equipment. I don't want to is not an excuse. I don't want to is an emotion, right? So everything is fixed today. That's true. You can't do anything differently right now. But within 2 or 3 years, you should do a lot of things differently if you want to. What else? A lot of new technology coming. I guarantee you, the pace of technology is only going to get faster, whether it's IT, crop chemical, seed genetics, machinery. So do you have a program in place? And like I said, I know that you're here today because you want to hear about that technology and how to use it. But you have to adopt it, and then hopefully you can adapt it. Here's the thing I know about the technology providers. They know about the technology, but they don't know how it works on your farm. It might perform better than they expect, or it might perform worse than they expect. It's your job to find out, because what they say might be true for somebody else's farm, but you need to know about your farm. So adopting and adapting. And lastly, asset discipline. Basically, this is about land. Single biggest asset in farming. 86% of the farmer's balance sheet, rancher and farmer balance sheet, is land. 86%. There's nothing more important to farming and ranching than the value of real estate. Now, I think land's overvalued in general. Does that mean you should sell your land? No. But I guarantee you this, we saw with Purdue, it's going to be the same thing we see in land values. You're going to find out that really, really good ground is priced just as hard as it can be priced. Almost for break even, probably a little beyond there. That's not the problem. The real problem is that mediocre ground or average ground is priced way too close to great ground. Your job as an asset manager is to think about what should I buy and what should I sell. You wouldn't be very impressed with a stock person who, whenever they bought a stock, never sold it. Because no matter what happened, they say, oh, I bought it, I'm never going to sell it again. No, you got to reevaluate companies. They change. You got to look at the market, take that opportunity.